Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at a crisis that is quietly but aggressively tearing through our communities. We're going to impartially unpack the absolutely horrific physiological and societal realities of modern methamphetamine use. And we're going to do this by looking at how the damage radiates outward. It doesn't just stop with the user. It's like a rock dropped in a pond. It forms these concentric circles of destruction that ultimately end up impacting every single one of us. Okay, let's dive into this. To truly understand the trap of this drug, we first have to look at the psychological void it exploits. Hearing from individuals struggling with severe dependency highlights a really tragic reality, which is just total social isolation. Methamphetamine often enters the picture under this false promise of connection or intimacy, right? But it eventually hollows out the user's life until the drug and the digital platforms they use to find it become their literal only remaining link to the outside world. So here is the clinical journey we're about to take. We'll start at the microscopic level with the brain under siege, move to total physiological collapse, map out the addiction spiral, look at the HIV and STI syndemic, expand out to collateral damage, and finally end up at macro-level community and economic ruin. Part 1. The brain under siege. Let's look at the direct biological impact. It all begins with neurotoxicity. Meth isn't just a stimulant, it is profoundly neurotoxic. It actively destroys the brain. When this drug crosses the blood-brain barrier, it goes right after the dopamine and serotonin axons. Think of those as the brain's critical communication wires. This incredible metabolic stress causes cellular death. It actually accelerates gray matter loss in the specific regions of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and risk assessment. So we are talking about permanent structural brain damage. Now, what's really interesting about this mechanism is the contrast with how our brains are supposed to work. A normal, healthy brain releases dopamine in manageable baseline amounts to reward us for natural behaviors, like eating a great meal or hugging a loved one. Methamphetamine completely hijacks and shatters that system. It actually reverses the brain's transporters, pumping out massive, entirely unnatural quantities of dopamine into the synapses, all while destroying the protective vesicles inside the cells. This unnatural flood literally burns out the brain's receptors. And that receptor burnout leads directly to a terrifying condition called anhedonia. Because the brain had to shut down its natural dopamine receptors just to survive that toxic flood of meth we just talked about, the user permanently loses the capacity for natural happiness. Let that sink in. Without the drug, they experience a total physiological inability to feel pleasure, joy, or even basic daily motivation. They are biologically trapped in despair. Part 2. Total physiological collapse. Expanding our lens to systemic physical failure. The systemic physical failure here is just catastrophic. The drug forces the body into a continuous, artificial fight-or-flight state. That causes extreme cardiovascular strain. To put it in perspective, meth users are 3.5 times more likely to suffer a heart attack and over 6 times more likely to have a stroke. Lethal body temperatures can also trigger rhabdomyolysis, which is this rapid breakdown of muscle tissue that poisons and shuts down the kidneys. Then, of course, there is the dramatic physical decay, the severe tooth enamel erosion we commonly call meth mouth, and chronic, non-healing skin sores. And those skin sores are often driven by something called formication. Meth frequently induces a severe schizophrenia-like psychosis. One of the absolute most visceral horrors of this psychotic state is the delusional, unshakable belief that insects, often called meth bugs, are crawling just beneath the flesh. This delusion leads to compulsive skin picking, which leaves the user's body covered in deep, infected, open wounds. Part 3. The addiction spiral. How this biological damage creates an inescapable cycle. Let's move along and see how this builds into a pathological life cycle. It often starts innocently enough with casual exposure, sometimes facilitated easily through digital dating apps. But that massive dopamine surge we discussed, it quickly causes a permanent neurochemical shift. The brain downregulates its receptors, plunging the user into severe anhedonia. Finally, just to escape that biological inability to feel joy, they hit total dependency. They aren't even using to get high anymore, right? They're using literally just to survive the psychological agony of withdrawal.
And one of the most devastating psychological effects of this dependency is the creation of what's called the sober sexual void. Because meth profoundly alters the brain's reward pathways during intimacy, the user's sexual identity becomes completely fused with the drug. Over time, natural, sober human connection and intimacy feel frustrating, mundane, or even physically and psychologically impossible. The drug just entirely strips away their ability to naturally connect with another human being. Part 4. The HIV and STI syndemic. Let's look at how this accelerates other deadly diseases. The scale of this syndemic is terrifying, and these numbers brilliantly illustrate the reality. According to a major U.S. national cohort study, persistent methamphetamine users are 7.11 times more likely to contract HIV compared to non-users. 7 times! The drug is a primary, heavy driver in the acceleration and transmission of infectious diseases. So why does that transmission risk skyrocket so dramatically? Well, it's a mix of biology and behavior. Methamphetamine causes severe vasoconstriction and extreme mucosal dryness. That leads to microscopic tissue tearing, which provides direct entry points for blood-borne pathogens. When you combine that physical vulnerability with the severe disinhibition that leads to condomless encounters, plus the highly dangerous practice of sharing intravenous needles, which is known as slamming, you have the absolute perfect storm for spreading HIV, hepatitis C, and syphilis.
Part 5. Collateral damage. Widening the lens to partners, families, and children.
The domestic collapse follows a tragic, completely predictable timeline. Within days, paranoia and psychosis breeds severe household conflict and domestic violence. With a month, the total obsession with the drug leads to job loss, property theft, and severe financial ruin. And over the years, the ultimate victims emerge: the children. Parental meth use is a leading driver of severe child neglect. These cases result in lower family reunification rates, massive strain on the foster care system, and generational trauma inflicted on innocent kids who had absolutely no agency in their exposure. Part 6. Community and economic ruin. Zooming out to the systemic environmental costs,
5 million. That is the staggering estimated number of U.S. housing units, which is about 4% of the entire national housing stock, that are currently contaminated with toxic meth residue. Because meth smoke lingers and binds to surfaces, it basically creates a biohazard. Right now, an estimated 13 million non-users, including countless infants and children, are living in contaminated homes, suffering the health consequences of third-hand exposure without even knowing it. So the crucial point here is cleaning up that specific mess comes with an astronomical price tag: $250 billion. That's the economic backlog required just to remediate the currently contaminated housing supply in the U.S., with another $15 billion added every single year from new contamination. And this massive financial burden falls directly on landlords, taxpayers, and local municipalities. And remember, that is just housing. The broader economic burdens are crippling. Meth addiction saturates our hospital emergency rooms, with patients suffering from psychosis and cardiovascular failure, draining millions in uncompensated care. It litters our public parks and sanitation systems with discarded needles, creating deadly biohazards for civic workers. And it vastly reduces our national economic productivity through premature death, mass incarceration, and chronic workplace absenteeism. When you map it all out, from the permanent destruction of the brain's dopamine receptors to the collapse of the family unit, all the way to the multi-billion-dollar poisoning of our housing supply, you see a disaster that refuses to stay contained. It's a slow-moving catastrophe. So as this damage radiates from the individual out to the economy, we have to ask ourselves, what is the true compounding cost of this crisis to our communities? But listen, there is an ethical off-ramp and a critical lifeline for those caught in the center of this storm. Free, confidential help is available 24/7. You can call the SAMHSA National Helpline at 1-800-662-4357. Help is waiting. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.